All right, friends. So now we've almost finished this application, but there is one last thing that I want to introduce you to, and that is the UseReducer Hook. Okay, so first of all, reducers, uh, basically, it's just a pattern of code which centralizes all of our methods for changing states into a single function. Now, you might be familiar with some reducers if you've already worked with Redux. So right now, this to-do list context provider component has two functions right here, add to do and remove to do. These are the functions, right? And they both interact with the state. So imagine that, let's say maybe in the future, if we were to make a bigger app or maybe even extend this app, we might have 4 or 5 functions that interact with the state. Yeah? And all that functioning might do different things, and then we'd have to pass each one of those functions into this value property in here. And then when we consume this context, we'd have to get all those functions separately in our components, which use them. And you see where I'm going with this, right? It would be kind of an extra job. It seems a little extra. So instead, what we could do is we're going to combine all of our functions into one single reducer function, which is going to make the app easier to maintain in the long run. So actually, it's just a coding pattern. And to be more clear, you don't have to use reducers if you don't want to. But if you want to, you absolutely can, because it may save you some time. Maybe on the other hand, you might want to centralize your functions. So there you have it. Okay, so let's see how you can use reducers in this project right here. So we broke down reducers into 3 different parts, right, to examine it. First, we have a reducer function, and that contains all of our state manipulation logic. It interacts with the state and changes the data in the state. Then we have our action object, which describes a type of change that we want to make inside the reducer function. For instance, we could have a type property with remove to do, and that's saying that we want the reducer function to remove a to do from the state. Then lastly, we have a dispatch function, which sends the action to the reducer. So we call this dispatch function, and we pass in the action, and that action goes to the reducer, and the reducer makes the change to the state. So imagine that we have our components and we want to remove a to-do when a button is clicked, just like we did in the previous lesson. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create an action object which describes the type of change that we want to make. And then we can also pass in a payload in here, which is a second argument, and that's the ID of the to-do that we want to remove from state. So I'm saying that in here, I want to remove a to-do from state, and the to-do that I want to remove is this ID. Okay. And then the next step would be to dispatch that action to the reducer using a dispatch function. The reducer takes in the action as a parameter, and it also takes in the state that we're manipulating. So if the state is going to be the to-dos, this is going to represent the to-dos state. So it takes in those 2 parameters right here. And then when we dispatch an action, it runs this reducer function. And the reducer function looks at this thing right here, the action. It looks at the action and checks the types of action. Now remember, type is this thing, and then based on that type, it runs some different logic to update the state object. So in this case, it would be remove to do from state. So it would take this state and looks at the type and the payload in action, and it says, okay, I should remove a to-do, which has an ID of 2 from state. All right, I can do that. So if it was an add to-do, if the type was add to, then it would check the action type and then add a to-do to the state. So in this case, the payload would be maybe some text that we want to add as to-do. So once we've updated the state, we return that state, and that goes back into the provider value props. So when we provide it to so many different components in the future, they will all consume it. And when it updates over here, they're going to get that updated value. So that's the long and short of it, or at least the basics of how a reducer works. In the next session, we're going to actually apply it, and I'm sure we're going to understand it a whole lot better when we start applying this logic. So let's take a short break right here, and we'll come back in the next lecture.